So underlying the paper, there's a broad, oh, sorry, I'll just move back one slide. So underlying the paper itself, there's a broad structure around both the industry context. So the first section is around the political, regulatory, and legislative frameworks that support these pilots. But then we go through the life cycle of the pilots themselves, from the scoping and design activity through the pilot execution phase into the pilot learnings and analysis. And that is a cycle that we're starting to see emerging. A lot of pilots are still in the pilot scoping and design phase or in the execution phase, but there needs to be a focus on this final section of using the data that we're developing to drive more insight and to inform the regulatory agenda. And then the same process will go on during the rollout, where you'll get mainstream rollout development, and then learning from the first rollouts, and obviously improving the scoping as we go forward. So that's the broad structure of how the paper was designed. So the first section looked at the industry framework, and it's our position that there are probably 5 things that could be done at the macro level to make the environment for funding pilots more successful. The first is a clear political mandate. And what we see is that regulators work best when they're regulating, they don't set policy. And as a consequence, you need to have a clear political mandate for what politicians want to achieve through the distribution and transmission networks. And if the policymakers set clear priorities and can talk about where trade-offs should be made, it makes life much easier for the utility companies to develop the pilots themselves. So what we've seen in the last 3 years is the emergence of the low-carbon economy as an equal driver to energy security, reliability, and consumer cost. And that's changed the balance of power in decision-making. What needs to be clear from a political perspective is what people want to achieve with their electricity distribution networks. Is there a long-term drive to move towards e-vehicles? Is there a long-term drive towards more distributed generation? Is there a focus on getting to a renewable portfolio of a certain percentage of the total portfolio generation mix? Each of those things will determine what type of pilot and ultimately what type of rollout will be structured. And not only that, it will give funders much more confidence that the regulatory mandates will reflect political stability. And that needs to be long-term. The second point is that the regulatory environment changes in the political mandate. And by that, certainly in the European context, the current regulatory environment reflects policy that was set in the mid-1990s and hasn't really evolved to reflect the changing priorities and certainly the low-carbon economy. And there are a couple of good examples of where some more forward-thinking regulators are starting to take that into account. But to be successful in transitioning from pilot to rollout, the regulatory environment needs to be conducive to these types of investments, and they need to encourage the right type of activities on the behalf of the utility companies. So, for example, in deregulated markets, there's a real challenge of how you align incentives across the value chain. The people that are investing may not be the people that are reaping the rewards of the smart grid. And as a consequence, that misalignment of incentives and risk and reward will require changes to the regulatory regime in order to encourage that type of investment. The second point is something that was made clear to me by a gentleman from IDEO, Tim Brown. And he was saying that the whole point about pilots is you need to have permission to fail. And regulated utility companies aren't used to taking risks with their customers' money. And regulators don't like the utilities to take risks. And as a consequence, it's very difficult to innovate in this space. And the challenge with smart grids is that it is an emerging nascent industry. And as a consequence, mistakes will be made. And if you penalize utility companies for trying to innovate in this space or not give them safe environments to innovate, then we'll almost certainly default to the lowest common denominator of regulatory environments and therefore the lowest common denominator of smart grid. The next point is really on interoperability and standards. And we have seen a lot of developments over the last 12 to 18 months, and there seems to be an opportunity for a much more rapid adoption of de facto standards. But a focus on improving interoperability will certainly make the utility investors much more willing to move into full-scale rollout without the risk of asset stranding and without the risk of technology obsolescence. And not only that, it will allow more, if you create an open platform for innovation, it will also encourage smaller, more nimble and innovative companies to create products and services that are more engaging to the consumer, and there's a role for regulators to play in there as well. Data privacy and security remains somewhat of an issue, although the issue is clearly not insurmountable. We've seen this problem solved rapidly in other industries. Reference architectures can evolve. We can take parallels from those other industries. And with clear standards and certifications, they'll provide enough rigor to invest with that the first lesson learned is that clarity of scope is absolutely critical. And by that I mean that the scope should reflect the political and regulatory mandates that are being set, and there is a real horses for courses aspect to this. There isn't a one-size-fits-all policy for what the smart grid will look like. And as a consequence, each utility will need to look at what the objectives are and what the regulatory mandate is that's being set. And in some cases, you may end up with a much more grid-centric pilot. And in other cases, you may end up with a much more consumer-centric pilot. And we look at that in some detail because a solution from a grid-based pilot activity to touch the consumer, a whole series of new challenges emerge, and the risk increases significantly. That risk can be mitigated, but it changes the tenor of the type of pilot that's being put in play. And there is an awful lot that can be achieved just by tackling the grid itself. But as soon as that transitions to a meter installation or to home area networking, the level of engagement that's required to explain to the consumer what's happening brings a whole series of new opportunities and challenges to the table, and utilities should be prepared for that in the pilot activity. And clear scoping certainly helps in that activity, and I'll come on to that in a bit more detail later. The second is this point about separation of conflated objectives. Now, I'll explain a little bit about what I mean by that. So I talked about the fact that that you can end up in a situation where you can't demonstrate cause and effect. And what we've started to see here is that at the front end of the process of piloting, there's a real focus on the technology itself. But also utility companies would very much like to understand the operating model and process changes that are required. And ultimately, there may be business model changes in the way that, introduction of time of use tariffs, for example. However, if you try and change the business model at the same time, i.e., if you try and introduce time of use tariffs at the same time that you're bedding in the smart meter, it's very difficult to understand if the customer rejects the process, whether it was the technology that they're rejecting, the installation process, i.e. the operating model and the process, or the time of use tariff. And that's a real lesson learned for us specifically, is to say, well, actually, bed in the technology a little bit to begin with, and then focus on the operating model changes that are required, and then think about what the business model changes will need to be. And it's almost like a capability release structure. If you think about this in terms of capabilities and capability releases, you can drive hygiene in terms of the kind of scientific test hygiene into the project in a lot more detail. So the third area is that there is a great opportunity here to test new business and operating models. And the focus does need to move beyond technology and should focus on the process changes, both in the installation and the front office processes, but also in the back office processes. And then there's also an opportunity here to try new business models with consumer segments. And one of the things that we'll come on to at the end, and certainly the sixth area there, the focus on the consumer, what we would certainly suggest in the scoping process is to conduct a behavioral segmentation, because what you'll find is that across the customer base, there'll be different expectations in relation to smart grid, and as a consequence, the way that the product and services that would be offered and the potential business models for engaging those consumers will be quite different. But also their ability to change may be different, and the installation process might be different. So, for example, if you were to go to the house of an elderly person who maybe has very little kind of technical skill, the nature of the installation process might need to be different to the installation process for a single male in his 20s. And if that behavioral segmentation is married to process change, then you significantly reduce the risk of customer rejection in the process. The fourth area that we looked at was the need for broad performance tracking, and that needs to be built into the scoping exercise itself. So look at the metrics that are going to be measured, but with a view to the future business case and how you want to change the future business case. So a little earlier I talked about the transition from business casing to value casing. And that requires a fundamentally different set of metrics. But also you need to collect contextual data so that after the project has been completed and when you're sharing data with other parties, you can use that contextual data to normalize the findings. And then finally, what we have seen is that the smart grid has required a much more multidisciplinary team than has maybe been traditional. And not only that, the nature of the contracting has been quite different, with a much more partnership and multidisciplinary aspect, or closer multidisciplinary teamwork. And that drives a series of challenges. You need to be clear about the motives and the governance of each of the parties, especially when those parties are investors as opposed to paid participants. But also that requires setting up a strong PMO and a really clear design authority, so it's clear who is responsible for making the end decisions about how the scope is structured.